7 Deadly Stupidities, Soviet General Petrov and the Almost End of the World, an example of how one man named Stanislav Petrov stared down all 7 of the stupidities. There's a book and movie from the 1960s called Failsafe. It's the story of how a fleet of U.S. military aircraft mistakenly flies across the Atlantic to drop a nuclear bomb on Moscow. The entire time the planes are in flight and the U.S. is trying to recall the mission, the leaders of both countries are on the phone with the U.S. telling the Soviets that this is a mistake and not an act of war. The U.S. bombers don't respond to the recall messages because they believe these messages are fake and sent by the Soviets to sabotage their mission. In the movie, the bomb is dropped and Moscow is destroyed. The U.S. president then offers a solution to avoid an all-out nuclear war with the Soviets. He will have a U.S. military aircraft drop a similar bomb on New York City. In the end, Moscow and New York cities are destroyed, but each country stays intact. Whew, crazy stuff, right? But this was the way it was back then. Here's a transcription of part of the movie that gives us a sense of the feeling between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time. This is part of the dialogue where a professor is educating U.S. military leaders.
The Russian aim is to dominate the world. They think that communism must succeed eventually if the Soviet Union is left reasonably intact. They know that a war would leave the Soviet Union utterly destroyed. Therefore, they would surrender.
But suppose they feel they can knock us off first?
They know we might have a doomsday system. Missiles that will go into action days, even weeks after a war is over, and destroy an enemy even after that enemy has already destroyed us. These are Marxist fanatics, not normal people. They do not reason the way you reason, General Black. They are not motivated by human emotions such as rage and pity. They are calculating machines.
So imagine the real-life case of Soviet Colonel Stanislav Petrov. In 1983, at the peak of the Cold War, Petrov was the officer on duty when the Soviets' early warning system indicated that a launch of missiles from the U.S. was targeted at the Soviet Union. The system told him 5 missiles were inbound. The missiles, each with multiple nuclear warheads, would strike and detonate in the Soviet Union in less than 20 minutes. The way the Soviet system worked at the time, if Petrov followed protocol and immediately reported the incoming missiles up the chain to the Soviet command, the automatic response would be a full-scale nuclear retaliatory strike on the US, basically the end of the world. But in Petrov's mind, something was not quite right, so he hesitated to report the strike. He started instead to think deliberately, assemble data, and go full-on Kahneman System too. Remember, his basis was US versus Soviet Union, and it was winner take all. So Petrov carefully thought, why just 5 missiles and not an all-out strike from the US on the Soviet Union? 5 missiles would be akin to the US poking the bear, and the Soviets would respond with overwhelming force. So strategically, the 5-missile attack made no sense to Petrov. Warfare expert Jeffrey Lewis from an NPR interview had this to say.
Well, we got lucky. As it turns out, even though the Soviet warning systems were doing everything that they needed to result in a launch, the duty officer, a guy named Stanislav Petrov, he just had this feeling in his gut that it wasn't right. It was 5 missiles. It didn't seem like enough. So even though by all of the protocols he had been trained to follow, he should absolutely have reported that up the chain of command. And, we should be talking about the Great Nuclear War of 1983 if any of us survived. He didn't.
Yeah. So what did Petrov really do? Well, it's simple. Before making this monumental tectonic decision, he changed the dynamic of the decision-making process. Petrov had his team verify the facts before a decision was made. As it turns out, there was a reflection from the sun off the clouds that the early warning system interpreted as incoming missiles. Once verified, there was no need for Petrov to pull the trigger. He made the decision without his palms sweating and heart racing. Given the tensions between the countries at that time, nobody would have faulted Petrov for following protocol and hitting the button. In fact, Petrov was heavily criticized and interrogated by the Soviets for his behavior. But years later, he was hailed as an international hero. Given the tensions between the US and Soviet Union at the time, it would have been easy for Petrov to jump right in, pull the trigger, and be in the middle of the action. Staying out of the action, in fact, was much harder, but he managed to overcome his fear and think rationally. He did not rely on family and friends. In this circumstance, Petrov could have accessed his comrades, both above and below him in rank, to solicit advice. But doing so may have created more problems for Petrov than he wanted, since his friends may have turned him in for treason for even questioning the protocol. In another post about the family and friend stupidity, we talk about how only 1 of 3 outcomes is a good outcome when relying on advice from family and friends. Petrov's situation was no different, except the fate of the world rested upon his decision. He did not use quick and dirty thinking. If he did, his attitude would have been, "System says fire the missiles, let's fire first and ask questions later." Kudos to Petrov for avoiding this catastrophic stupidity. He was not blinded by the upside. Even if he was saving the world, literally, Petrov knew that in the Soviet military there was no upside to his decision. He wouldn't exactly be getting promoted for questioning protocol or hesitating like he did. He likely understood that his decision was all downside for him personally. The glory and upside would have been in pressing the button and having the Soviet Union destroy the United States. He did not go for a moonshot. Quite contrary to trying to change the world and revolutionize the Soviet defense infrastructure, Petrov did the opposite. He stayed focused on what incremental changes he could make to improve the situation, like rechecking instruments and being satisfied that his data was verified. Just another day at the office. He did not trust the media. From the introductory paragraphs above, we know how the US viewed the Soviets and vice versa. These attitudes were only amplified by the media, and Petrov, a Soviet commander, was well schooled in the perception of the US, as in, these are our enemies and must be destroyed. Yet he did not let the media dictate his emotions and take over his decision-making. He did measure twice. Boy, did he ever. Perhaps that paltry 5-missile attack did not make sense to Petrov at a subconscious level. Or maybe he said it out loud. Why would they only send 5 missiles instead of 500? In either case, Petrov measured once by registering the problem, then did the critical second measurement by rechecking the instruments to realize that it was not an unprovoked attack by a hated adversary, but simply a weather anomaly. Quite a guy this Petrov was. What was the key to his clear-headed thinking? Well, he did not try to add anything to the process, but rather he deduced that it would be better to eliminate items from the decision-making. Petrov knew he was on the cusp of a tectonic decision, and whether or not he realized it, he clicked through each of the 7 deadly stupidities and steered clear of them all. We must be more like Petrov and move stupidities out of the way to clear a path to a better decision. Who knows? We might be saving ourselves or the world in the process.
This episode was recorded at Summerfield Studios, narrated by Milen Hayriyan, produced by me, George Polari, sound consulting by Christopher Perazio, and music consulting by Jimmy Lorius. And finally, editorial review by J.D. Clanky. And never forget, 80% of success is avoiding stupidity.